August 17th, 1859. Savannah. The auction house breathes like a beast in heat. Sweat, cigar smoke, and whispers thick enough to choke a man. Wooden paddles rise and fall to the rhythm of greed until the auctioneer calls Lot 43. A hush. Even the ceiling fans seem to stall. On the platform stands a man in chains, tall, lean, eyes too calm for a slave. He looks at the crowd the way a preacher looks at sinners. 27 bidders lower their paddles one by one until only Thomas Pewitt, a new plantation owner from Charleston, remains. $10. The gavel cracks. Sold. What Thomas doesn't know is that every man in that room stayed silent for a reason. They've seen what happens to anyone who tries to own Elias, the last unsold slave of Chatham County. 6 months from that day, Thomas will understand why the others looked away. By then, his fields will bloom with fear, and the only harvest left will be justice. If stories like this pull you in, where every choice has a cost and every man carries his own reckoning, stick around. Hit subscribe, share this with someone who feels the weight of legacy and loyalty, and stay till the end. Because this isn't just history, it's a mirror, and what it shows might change how you see power, justice, and the debts every man must pay. Heat pressed against Savannah like judgment itself, the kind that made shirts cling and tempers short. Inside Broughton Street's auction house, men fanned themselves with folded bills, eyes sharp and hungry for profit. The floorboards creaked under boots stained by the river mud of trade. Tobacco smoke curled toward the rafters, blurring sunlight that slipped through cracked shutters, slicing the air into bands of gold and shadow. Every man in that room had come for one reason: labor, flesh turned into currency. Yet beneath their usual swagger, a strange unease stirred, quiet as breath before a storm. The auctioneer's mallet struck once, wood against wood, summoning attention like a judge's gavel. Voices faded. A page turned in the ledger. Lot 43, he announced. The murmurs stopped altogether. 2 handlers guided a man onto the platform. Chains rattled softly, but his posture remained straight. Eyes forward, unbroken. He looked at them, not pleading, not proud, just aware. Something in that stillness unsettled them. Men who'd broken others with whips and numbers found themselves lowering their gaze, pretending to study boots, hats, the wooden floor. Anything but him. He was called Elias. No surname, no history on record, just the brief note. 33 years old, field-trained, literate, skilled in medicine. Price set at $10 to start. The auctioneer's voice tried for energy, but even he sounded reluctant, like a priest forced to read cursed scripture. $10. Gentlemen, 10? Silence replied, thick and patient. Thomas Pewitt watched from the middle rows. New to Savannah, his jacket too fine, his face too eager. He thought himself prepared for everything a sale like this could show, yet he'd never seen a room recoil like that. The same men who'd argued over boys and oxen now sat stiff, eyes down, unwilling to lift a single paddle. $10, repeated the auctioneer, sweat dripping onto his ledger. 9, perhaps? 8? Still nothing. Elias simply stood there, head tilted slightly, watching their cowardice unfold. Thomas raised his paddle without thinking. 10, he said. The word cracked the silence like thunder. Every head turned. Some men winced, others muttered under breath, one laughed dryly. Sold, the auctioneer said too quickly, relief breaking through professionalism. The gavel fell, sealing the exchange that no one else dared to make. The room exhaled uneasy. Elias looked at Thomas then, calm, assessing, like a man measuring weather before a long voyage. A moment passed between them, brief but heavy with recognition neither could name. Outside, Savannah's heat swallowed sound. Horses stamped against cobblestones, and a carriage waited under the shadow of moss-draped oaks. The world continued as though nothing had changed. Yet Thomas felt something shift, subtle as gravity turning. He'd bought a man for less than the price of a used plow, and somehow it felt like he'd signed a covenant. Hutchkins, his overseer, joined him by the door. A lean man with skin like weathered bark, eyes narrow from years of command. "Sir," he murmured, "that one's trouble." Thomas glanced back toward the platform, where handlers were unlocking Elias's restraints. "Trouble or not," he said, "he's mine now." The words tasted like arrogance, but he meant them. They left the auction house through a corridor lined with portraits of dead traders. Faces painted in oil, staring down in silent judgment. Ghosts of men who'd thought themselves masters. The carriage wheels groaned as they rolled toward the Waverly Plantation, an hour south along the Vernon River. Cypress trees watched from both sides, dripping with moss like gray hair. Thomas tried to read Hutchkins's face for explanation, but the man only spat out the window. "Ain't my place to question a master's purchase," he said. "Just hope you've got prayers." "What's his story?" Thomas asked. Hutchkins hesitated, scratching his jaw. "Came from the Benton place. Whole line of men dead within months. They said he healed them first, then they died anyway." Thomas frowned. "Poison?" "Don't know," Hutchkins said flatly. "But I'd keep that one where you can see him. He don't talk much, don't fight either. Just waits." The road curved along the river's edge, water glinting dull silver beneath the sun. Insects droned. The sound felt ancient, endless, like the land whispering old sins through the heat. Thomas's father had built fortune in Charleston by gambling on cotton futures, dying before he could lose it all. His son inherited wealth, not wisdom. This plantation was meant to prove himself. He thought of legacy, of land that could outlive him, of men who'd built empires from soil and sweat. Yet beneath ambition, unease threaded quietly, a worm beneath the root. By the time they reached Waverly's gates, dusk had thickened. Columns of the main house rose pale against the orange sky, shadows stretching long across the fields like fingers reaching backward. Hutchkins barked orders to the hands gathering at the carriage. Elias stepped down without prompting, his chains gone, his stance balanced like a soldier awaiting instruction. Thomas motioned to an empty cabin near the quarters. "He'll stay there," he said. Hutchkins hesitated. "Sir, we got room in the bunkhouse." Thomas shook his head. "No, separate." Elias didn't react. He simply nodded once, a motion more of acknowledgement than obedience. Thomas couldn't decide whether he respected it or feared it. Later, after the evening meal, Thomas walked alone past the rows of cabins. Night carried the smell of smoke and damp soil. Crickets sang their endless hymn of repetition. Through an open window, he saw Elias sitting by a single candle. The man wrote carefully in a small notebook, words etched with slow precision, lips moving as if in prayer. Thomas watched longer than he meant to. The handwriting, the calm. There was something unshackled about it, as though Elias obeyed the law of no master but his own mind. The following morning, Hutchkins approached with a question he didn't want answered. "Sir, you plan to keep him near the sick?" Thomas nodded. "He's trained in medicine, isn't he?" Hutchkins grimaced. "That's what they all said at Benton. Healed the overseer's son from fever. 2 weeks later, both father and son dead. Doctor couldn't explain it. Nobody could." Thomas forced a smile. "Maybe bad luck. Maybe the Lord's will." Hutchkins didn't return it. "Luck's a man's excuse when he don't understand what's coming." Elias began work quietly, tending wounds, brewing remedies, moving through the quarters like smoke, seen but untouchable. Men respected him out of gratitude and something colder. Self-preservation. Thomas noticed changes within weeks, fewer sick reports, faster recovery. Even the fields seemed calmer, as though discipline had shifted from fear to faith in Elias's quiet command. At night, though, Thomas dreamed of the auction house, the silence before his bid. The way the men had looked away. That silence began to echo in everything he did. One evening, he joined the other planters for bourbon at Josiah Crenshaw's parlor. Stories turned to gossip, and gossip to warnings. Someone mentioned the Benton deaths again. "Elias," Crenshaw said, eyebrows lifting. "That man's not cursed. He's patient. Waits until his debts line up. He heals, yes, but he also keeps score. Always balances what's owed." Thomas laughed too quickly. "You sound like a preacher." Crenshaw poured another glass, leaned in. "No preacher, friend. Just a man who's seen scales tip when they shouldn't." The night wind followed Thomas home, whispering through oak branches. In his study, he couldn't shake the thought. What kind of man keeps a ledger not for money but for justice? Before sleep took him, he imagined Elias in his candlelit cabin, writing again, counting not coins, but souls, and wondered if somewhere in that quiet book his own name was written. Morning mist clung to the cotton rows like breath from the earth itself. The plantation stirred awake, boots hitting mud, iron tools clinking against wagons. Thomas Puett stood on the veranda, watching his inheritance come alive. Elias moved among the men with quiet precision, giving orders Hutchkins didn't question. It should have bothered Thomas, this subtle authority, but the results were undeniable. Fields ran smoother, tempers cooler, sickness nearly gone. No whip cracked that day, yet work moved faster than ever. Elias's presence carried a gravity that made even defiance seem foolish. Men nodded to him as one nods to a man who sees further than others. When a fever struck a stable hand named Reuben, Elias was already there before dawn, mixing tinctures from his worn leather pouch, the air filled with sharp scents of crushed bark and iron-sweet herbs. Thomas found him bent over the cot, whispering something not in English. When the sick man's breathing steadied, Elias stood and said, "He'll see the next sunrise." He said it like a prophecy, not a guess. By noon, Reuben sat up asking for water. Word spread. Even Hutchkins, who distrusted miracles, muttered, "That one's touched by something older than books." Thomas wanted to dismiss it, but deep down he agreed. Later that week, Thomas rode out with Josiah Crenshaw to inspect flood damage along the river. Crenshaw poured him a drink by the bank and said, "You're letting that healer weave roots too deep." Thomas replied, "He's saving lives, Josiah. Can't fault a man for doing what our doctors fail to do." Crenshaw stared at the current. "Saving ain't free. Every cure carries a cost somewhere else." When Thomas returned home, he found Elias teaching two younger men about poultices. They listened with the focus of soldiers learning survival. "Knowledge," Elias said, "is a weapon. Use it right. It protects. Wrong. It destroys." That night, Hutchkins knocked on Thomas's door. "Sir, one of the old men's gone missing. Daniel says he saw him last with Elias near the herb garden." Thomas frowned. "Missing or hiding?" "Don't know," Hutchkins muttered. They searched until midnight. The old man, Levi, was found by the river's edge, alive, trembling, muttering about debts. "Said he dreamed of chains breaking," Hutchkins whispered. "Said Elias told him he was free in spirit." Thomas dismissed it as delirium, yet the words clung like burrs. Free in spirit. What kind of slave preached freedom to other men while bowing to none? Elias's calm became more unnerving than rebellion. In the following days, small miracles multiplied. Wounds healed faster, crops resisted rot, and men worked as though drawn by unseen rhythm. The plantation seemed blessed, though Thomas felt the blessing watching him back. He started noticing carvings, small symbols etched into door frames, cabin posts, even trees by the well. Circles crossed by lines balanced like scales, each one carefully drawn, precise, deliberate. When Thomas asked Elias about them, the healer simply said, "Protection marks. They keep sickness away." His tone was even, but his eyes carried something heavier. belief, conviction, or warning. Crenshaw visited again, uneasy. Heard talk that your man writes names in a book. Men swear he chooses who lives and who dies. Thomas laughed, but found no humor in it. Every master keeps lists, he said. Crenshaw leaned closer. Not like his. Elias ain't keeping ledgers for cotton. He's keeping ledgers for justice. He left without drinking his bourbon. Thomas stared at the untouched glass long after his friend's horse vanished. That night, thunder rolled across the horizon, bringing a storm that ripped shingles and flooded fields. Lightning struck the smokehouse, setting half the roof ablaze. Elias was first to the fire, dragging buckets with men behind him. They worked until dawn. By morning, the rain ceased, and what stood of the smokehouse still smoked faintly, but no one had died. Elias moved through the wreckage, soot on his skin, calm as stone. Thomas approached, drenched and exhausted. "You work like a man trying to pay something off," he said. Elias met his gaze. "We all owe something, master. Some debts we choose, some we inherit." Days passed, and the plantation steadied. Yet every success carried unease, like laughter in a churchyard. Men whispered that Elias could see death before it came, that he knew whose time approached. When Hutchkins fell from his horse and broke a rib, Elias treated him before Thomas could summon a doctor. The overseer healed within days, though he confessed afterward, "Felt him looking through me, sir, like he saw more than bone." Thomas visited Elias's cabin one evening, candlelight flickering against walls lined with herbs. A notebook lay open, filled with careful handwriting, names, dates, marks beside each. "You keep records?" Thomas asked. "I keep balance," Elias replied. Outside, the night pressed heavy with crickets. Thomas lingered. "Balance for what?" Elias closed the notebook softly. "For everything that breathes and bleeds, master. When one life's saved, another owes its weight." Hutchkins later found a dead snake on the steps of his quarters, coiled neatly as though laid by hand. Some said it was warning, others said protection. Thomas didn't know which chilled him more. As weeks turned to months, Waverly grew strange. Prosperous, yes, but quieter. Men worked with an unspoken reverence, voices low around Elias. Fear and faith had become indistinguishable. One evening, Daniel, the head driver, came to Thomas's study. "Sir, the men trust Elias more than the whip. He listens, he heals. They die for him." His tone held admiration and fear together. Thomas asked, "And you?" Daniel shrugged. "I die for what's right. He makes men remember right and wrong ain't written in ledgers. They're written in what a man does when no one's watching." That night, Thomas dreamed of his father's voice saying, "A master without fear is blind." He woke to rain tapping the window and a candle burning lower than he'd left it. Elias stood outside in the dawn fog, waiting. "Another fever," he said. "A boy this time." Thomas followed, boots sinking into mud, pulse tight. Every illness now carried the taste of judgment. The boy lived. Elias never explained what herbs he used, only said, "Sometimes healing is mercy. Sometimes mercy is correction." Thomas didn't ask what he meant. He already knew. By midsummer, word spread beyond Chatham County. Planters came seeking Elias's remedies. Some offered gold. Elias refused payment. "My work pays itself," he said, and his tone made even the proudest men nod in silence. Crenshaw returned once more, weary. "You think you own him, but he's rewriting ownership, Thomas. You ain't master of Waverly anymore. You're caretaker of his balance." Thomas didn't argue. Deep down, he feared it was true. In August, a riverboat captain brought fever to the coast. Within days, plantations fell ill one by one. At Waverly, Elias moved through cabins like wind, treating dozens until exhaustion hollowed his face. When the fever broke, Waverly alone remained standing. Other estates buried their dead. Crenshaw lost half his workforce. He rode out, eyes haunted. "You were spared," he told Thomas. Maybe spared means chosen. Thomas looked across his fields, alive with men who worked under Elias's quiet watch. Chosen, perhaps. But for what? Mercy or reckoning? The question followed him like a shadow he could never step out of. That night, Elias lit candles in the quarters. Men gathered around as he spoke of balance, of debts, of brothers keeping each other alive when the world refused to. His words sounded like both sermon and warning. Thomas watched unseen from the dark, realizing the truth. Elias hadn't freed them from chains. He'd forged new ones, chains of loyalty, of belief, of justice, redefined. Stronger than iron, impossible to break. The next morning, Thomas found a symbol carved into his own doorframe. The same scales he'd seen before, drawn clean, symmetrical. Beneath it, one word scratched deep into the wood: Ode. He traced the letters with his thumb. Somewhere behind him, he heard Elias's calm voice. "Balance always finds its mark, Master. It just waits until men stop pretending they're innocent." Thomas turned, but Elias was already walking back toward the fields, morning light catching the chain still hanging loosely from his wrist, unlocked yet never removed. Rain came before dawn, a steady whisper that soaked through the roofs and softened the edges of everything. Waverly lay half asleep under the gray sky, the fields dark as spilled ink. Thomas Puett sat at his desk, the ledger open, the candle half burned. Numbers blurred before his eyes. He wasn't reading anymore. He was waiting. He didn't know for what, only that it was coming. Outside, Elias moved through the rain like it wasn't there. He carried a bundle of herbs, every step measured, deliberate. The storm didn't slow him. It seemed to make space for him. Thomas had told himself that faith in Elias was practical, nothing more. But practicality doesn't explain why men whispered prayers that began with his name, or why Thomas now checked the horizon before every decision. That morning, Hutchkins found him by the porch. "Sir," he said, "we buried Levi last night. He died in his sleep. Peaceful, they say." Thomas nodded, but the word peaceful felt like blasphemy. Elias hadn't been called to Levi's side. He'd known before anyone else. "Some debts," he had said quietly the day before, "collect themselves." Thomas hadn't asked what that meant, but he'd written the words down later. A week passed. The rain ended, leaving behind air heavy with decay and growth. The herb garden flourished wildly, plants bending under their own weight, fragrant and strange. Thomas walked there one evening and found Elias writing again, ink bleeding slightly in the damp. "You keep records of everyone," Thomas said. Elias didn't look up. "Not everyone. Only those who matter." Thomas frowned. "You decide who matters?" Elias paused, pen still. "We all decide, Master. Some just pretend not to." His tone wasn't defiant, only factual, like a man describing the weather. That night, curiosity overruled caution. Thomas went to Elias's cabin after midnight, pushed the door open and saw the ledger. Names filled the pages, men, dates, brief notes, a mark beside each. Some names carried a single stroke, others two, others a small circle. At the back, written differently, stood one name alone: Thomas Puett. No mark beside it. Not yet. He felt his pulse tighten. He lifted the book, read fragments aloud, phrases about mercy, justice, the scales between pain and peace. It wasn't madness. It was order. Ruthless, deliberate order. A floorboard creaked. Elias stood in the doorway, rain dripping from his shoulders. "You found it," he said softly. "Every master eventually finds what he fears most." Thomas closed the ledger, forcing calm. "You've written my name." Elias nodded. You've done things worth weighing. Everyone has. His eyes weren't angry. They were patient, like a teacher's. Thomas said, You think yourself a judge? Elias shook his head. A witness. Judgment belongs to the balance itself. I only record what it demands. The simplicity in his voice terrified more than threats. He left the cabin with the book still in his hands, but by morning it was gone. No one admitted to seeing it. Elias worked as though nothing had changed. The silence between them grew. That week a visitor arrived, Robert Benton, nephew of Elias's previous owner. His boots carried Savannah mud, his face arrogance polished by grief. You have what was ours, he said. Thomas poured bourbon and stayed polite. I paid what the market asked. Benton's eyes glinted. You paid for a ghost. He killed my uncle and 3 men besides. Everyone died smiling. Thomas dismissed it, but Benton leaned forward. He heals, doesn't he? That's how it starts. But his healing chooses its price. Watch your household, Mr. Pruitt. Watch who dies easy. That night, Thomas dreamed of the ledger again, his name pulsing like a wound on the page. He woke to the sound of Elias's voice outside, reciting something low, rhythmic, in a language older than prayer. The next morning, the cook collapsed in the yard. Elias reached her before anyone else, pressed herbs to her tongue, whispered words only he understood. She lived, though her skin turned pale as ash. Whispers spread. Men said Elias had drawn sickness out of her and buried it in the soil. When Thomas asked, Elias only said, I moved what was owed. The earth collects what men can't carry. Days blurred. Work never stopped, but laughter disappeared. Even Hutchkins, once cynical, began crossing himself before sunrise. The plantation's rhythm now beat to Elias's pulse. Thomas felt power slipping, subtle but complete. Orders were obeyed because Elias allowed them to be. The authority of law meant less than the authority of cure. It was invisible rule, older than ownership. He began searching for proof, anything to break the spell. In old estate papers, he found letters written by a man named Phoebe, a healer from decades past. The handwriting matched Elias's precisely. The discovery chilled him. Knowledge passed like blood, man to man, unbroken through time. Not witchcraft, inheritance. A lineage of memory surviving chains and masters. Elias wasn't anomaly, he was continuation. Thomas confronted him. You've done this before. Elias nodded slowly. Not me. Those before me. Men who carried balance when justice slept. I'm just the hand still holding the weight. Then what am I to you? Thomas demanded. Elias considered. The test. Every man thinks he's righteous until the balance proves otherwise. He smiled faintly. Don't worry, master. You're still unmarked. The word still gnawed at Thomas. He began locking his door at night, guarding his meals, counting breaths between footsteps. Yet each morning, Elias greeted him the same. Calm, unhurried, patient. When Crenshaw visited, Thomas told him everything. The old planter listened, face pale beneath his tan. You can't fight faith, he said. He's made himself the law. That evening, thunder rolled again. Elias stood in the rain, arms outstretched, letting lightning illuminate him like a prophet. Men watched from windows, whispering that their healer spoke with storms. Thomas felt the world tilt. The air itself seemed to favor Elias. Even nature obeyed him now. He began writing his own diary, trying to anchor himself before reason dissolved completely. The entries grew frantic. He knows me. He knows my father. He knows what I've done and what I've refused to do. The ink bled under trembling hands. Then Hutchkins fell ill. No warning, no wound, only exhaustion that deepened daily. Elias tended him, but the overseer's skin turned gray. He whispered apologies no one asked for. When he died, Elias said only, Guilt has a pulse. It beats until it can't. Thomas buried him at dawn, rain falling steady, as if the heavens themselves refused to cleanse the soil. That night, Thomas entered Elias's cabin again. The ledger lay open this time, waiting. Beside his name now was a mark, one single perfect line, not crossed, not finished, just begun. He stared until the candle burned low. Footsteps behind him. Elias's voice was calm. "Every man writes his own mark, master. I just keep the record." Thomas looked up, eyes raw. "Then tell me what I owe." Elias met his gaze. "You owe understanding, and the understanding always costs more than a man expects." Outside, lightning tore the sky open, revealing for one heartbeat the whole plantation. Fields shining, men waking, shadows stretching. For the first time, Thomas saw Waverly not as property, but as living judgment. The wind carried the smell of rain and iron. Elias closed the ledger gently, as though sealing something sacred. "When you finally understand, master," he said, "the mark will finish itself." Autumn returned with the smell of smoke and harvest. The fields stood gold beneath a bruised sky, and every breeze carried the faint hum of men working as though time itself demanded obedience. Thomas Puett rode along the rows, the hooves of his horse sinking softly into the damp soil. Each stalk bowed under its own weight, heavy, ready, resigned. It reminded him of men. Elias waited by the storage shed, sleeves rolled, face unreadable. The other workers parted when he passed, not from fear, but from recognition, like soldiers moving aside for the man who never lost a battle. "Another season ends," Thomas said, dismounting. Elias looked toward the horizon. "Nothing ends, master. It circles. Everything that grows must return. Everything that's taken must be paid back." Thomas nodded, though he didn't pretend to understand. The air carried the thick scent of rain and ash. Somewhere, thunder rumbled like an argument between gods too tired to finish. Later that day, Josiah Crenshaw arrived unannounced, mud splattered on his boots. He looked older, his hair thin and gray. "Thomas," he said, "word travels. They're calling your healer a prophet now." Thomas poured bourbon without ceremony. "He's no prophet, Josiah. Just a man who understands what most of us ignore." Crenshaw's eyes hardened. That kind of understanding breaks nations. They sat in silence, bourbon untouched. Outside, the sound of men singing drifted in, low, rhythmic, deep as the river. The words carried weight Thomas couldn't translate but could feel in his chest. "Listen to that," Crenshaw muttered. "That's not work song. That's worship." Thomas didn't answer. He'd heard it before, those same voices rising when Elias walked among them. That night, Elias came to the porch. The moon sat behind clouds, a faint halo bleeding through. "The air's changing," he said quietly. "The land feels it. So do men." Thomas studied him. "War's coming," Elias continued. "The kind that burns history and writes new scripture in blood. You'll have to choose which weight you carry when the scales tilt." Thomas looked past him to the fields, the cabins, the endless dark. "I'm tired of choosing," he said. Elias smiled faintly. "Then the balance will choose for you." Days later, riders from Savannah brought news, secession debates, talk of rebellion. The world outside Waverly was cracking. Inside, the plantation thrived unnaturally calm, as if the storm belonged to other men. One evening, Elias gathered the workers by firelight. Thomas watched from the shadows. "The scales of men," Elias said, "ain't measured in gold or flesh. They weigh what's owed and what's forgiven." He spoke of brothers, of debt, of legacy written not on paper but in blood and labor. Men listened as though hearing truth for the first time, heads bowed, hearts alive. Thomas found himself nodding, though his name still burned in memory, one mark in a hidden ledger that waited for completion. The sound of the fire cracked like punctuation to each unspoken vow. After the meeting, Elias approached him. "You've seen what I've built," he said. "A place where men stand straight, because they remember who they are. No whip, no lie, only worth." Thomas replied, "You've built faith on fear." Elias shook his head. "No, master. Fear built you. I'm tearing it down." His voice held no malice, only weary certainty born of too many reckonings. Later that night, thunder again. Rain came heavy, drowning the air, flooding paths. Thomas couldn't sleep. He walked to Elias's cabin, lantern in hand, water lapping at his boots. Elias sat inside, writing. The ledger lay open. The candle trembled in the draft. Thomas's voice was hoarse. "You said the mark finishes itself when understanding comes. Tell me, has it?" Elias looked up, eyes reflecting flame. "Almost." He turned the book toward Thomas. Beside his name, the single line had become a cross, complete, symmetrical, final. "You understand now what ownership costs." Thomas stared at it. "Then this means death?" Elias closed the book. "It means freedom. You freed yourself the moment you stopped believing anyone could be owned." Outside, lightning flared. Men stirred in the quarters, restless under the storm's voice. Thomas stepped closer. "What happens when the storm reaches here?" Elias said. "Then men decide who they want to be." The next morning brought silence sharper than thunder. The storm had passed, leaving broken branches and clean air. Thomas stood by the veranda rail, looking at the fields washed in light. Elias joined him. "They'll come for this place soon," he said. "When the war breaks, they'll burn everything they can't control." Thomas nodded. "And you?" "I'll stay. There's still teaching left." By mid-October, Savannah spoke openly of conflict. Men prepared rifles, planned defenses, argued about justice as if it could be traded. Waverly became a waiting room for history's verdict. One afternoon, Thomas brought Elias a folded paper. "Your freedom," he said. "Signed and witnessed. You're no man's property now." Elias read it, then looked at him with quiet amusement. "I was never property," he said, "but I'll take the paper. The world believes in such things." He tucked it into his coat. "What do you want in return, master?" Thomas shook his head. "Nothing. Consider it a payment on my own debt. Maybe the ledger can close." Elias smiled. "Ledgers never close. They only pass to other hands." The following days felt different. The men worked, but laughter returned. Elias still healed the sick, still wrote by candlelight, but something lighter moved in his steps, as though the burden had shifted. Crenshaw came once more, nervous. "They say you freed him." Thomas nodded. "Then you've done what none of us dared. You'll be ruined for it." Thomas answered, "Maybe ruin is what mercy looks like." When Crenshaw left, Elias was by the river, watching the water slide past roots and stones. "Balance holds, master," he said. "Always, even when men forget which side they're on." Thomas joined him, both silent for a long time. The river smelled of silt and beginnings. "You'll leave someday," Thomas said finally. Elias nodded. "When the land stops needing me." The harvest ended under a crimson sunset. Smoke from distant fires colored the horizon. Thomas felt it in his bones, the world turning toward reckoning. Elias's voice lingered beside him. Every debt paid in full. Weeks later, news reached them. War declared. Charleston ablaze with pride and fear. Thomas read the notice aloud, then folded it away like confession. Waverly stood untouched, for now. Elias spent that night walking the fields, touching each row as if in farewell. Men watched quietly, no one daring to interrupt. The moon hung low, the color of forgiveness. By dawn, he was gone. Only his cabin remained, the ledger gone with him. On Thomas's porch rail, carved deep into the wood, was a simple set of scales, perfectly even. Thomas traced them with his fingers, the grain rough, the meaning clear. He whispered, "Balance," not as a word of faith, but as acknowledgement. The wind answered through the pines, soft and endless. Years later, after the war, travelers found Waverly still standing. They spoke of a plantation where men once worked without chains, guided by a healer who vanished into legend. Some said he moved south, others north. But those who'd known him swore they felt him whenever justice caught up with cruelty or when mercy outlasted vengeance. Elias had simply become part of the soil. Thomas grew old, quiet, and unafraid. He kept no slaves, no overseers, only workers who called him by name, not title. Each evening he wrote a single line in his journal. "The balance holds." When he died, they buried him near the river, the same water that once mirrored Elias's reflection. On his headstone, chiseled with care, were 2 words: "Paid forward." And when rain fell that night, it sounded less like mourning than completion, as though the world itself exhaled. One long breath of debt finally settled, scales at last in perfect stillness.